Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing another really cool guest today involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Jamie Jonker, who is the National Milk Producer Federation's Chief Science Officer, Vice President of Sustainability and Scientific Affairs, where he serves as the organization's lead scientific expert on a range of dairy issues ranging from animal health and sustainability to dairy farm biosecurity, air and water quality, and a whole lot more. And he leads their organization's engagement with various scientific groups, such as the United States Animal Health Association, the International Dairy Federation, the World Animal Health Organization, and the Codex Alimentarius. Dr. Johnson also serves on the board of the International Dairy Federation's Board of Directors. In 2020, he was elected to chair their Science Program Coordinating Committee, and he's also involved in coordinating relations with the Federation's Animal Health and Wellbeing Committee and Environmental Issues Committee. Dr. Jonker received his bachelor's degree in animal science and his master's in animal science with a concentration in dairy cattle nutrition from Cornell. He did his Ph.D. At University of Maryland with a focus on animal and avian science, again with a dairy focus. And prior to the National Manufacturers Group, he worked at the National Academy of Sciences, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and the United States House of Representatives Committee on Agriculture. And just a little background, we'll hear more about it, but the National Milk Producers Federation was organized over 100 years ago, back in 1916, to ultimately provide this forum for dairy producers, the cooperatives, to ultimately participate in public policy discussions, and currently involved in advocating to the United States Congress and as well as foreign government agencies, industry organizations, and the media. We're honored to have a lot of interesting topics to get into today, but Dr. Jamie Jonker, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me, Ira. It's a great honor and privilege to be on your show. You've interviewed such interesting people in the past. It makes me wonder if I'm interesting enough to be here.
Well, thank you for that, Jamie. You definitely are interesting enough. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting topics here that we have not gotten into as a show. As we typically do, though, I would love to start off handing you the floor for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about you, a little bit of your background, obviously the development of your broad intellectual interest in animal science, avian science, of course, the dairy industry. And if you could take us sort of maybe up to sort of your PhD work, which I know is heavily focused in this area of milk urea nitrogen research, which as we'll be getting into some of these themes of health and sustainability and the environment, all sort of feed into this theme that you worked on a couple decades ago. Take us back to those days, if you would.
Sure. Thinking back to where did I get kind of my intellectual curiosity in dairy production, that's a very easy part of this process. I grew up on a dairy farm in upstate New York. My parents had a 100-cow dairy with my uncle, and so that really helped foment my interest in dairy production. From showing dairy animals at the county fair to being involved in Dairy Quiz Bowl, which is, think of it as kind of like a Jeopardy style program answering trivia questions about the dairy industry. Mm-hmm. And At one point in time, I was planning to either go back to my home dairy farm, or I was going to become a veterinarian. And I started my, I call it my meandering through college. I actually started at a 2-year ag and tech school, SUNY Cobleskill, part of this SUNY system in New York, where I did a 2-year program in dairy production and management. And you mentioned I moved on to Cornell for my bachelor's and master's. When I got to Cornell, I learned about graduate school and the difference between going to something like the vet school at Cornell or elsewhere and grad school. And it just piqued my interest. I got to work in with some of the professors doing a little bit of kind of the grunt work on some of the research, and thought, this is interesting. Grad school is interesting. You get to explore in-depth questions. Mm-hmm. And I spent 2 years at Cornell working on my master's with doctors Debbie Cherney and Danny Fox. They were working with a program called I'll call it the Cornell model for shortening it, really looking at how to feed dairy animals better. And we'll probably get back to a little bit of how that fits into some of the sustainability realm in the future. From there, I went to the University of Maryland working with Dr. Rick Cohn. And that's where I looked at milk-urea nitrogen. And let me try and give a 30 to 60 second summary of a 3 years of a PhD program and a dissertation of almost 200 pages and 4 scientific published articles. Cool. Essentially, milk-urea nitrogen comes from a byproduct of the partitioning of consumed protein in the dairy cow's diet. Yep. It's actually a waste product. The more that you have in the milk also means the more that you have in the bloodstream represents essentially a waste of protein in the diet. And we've developed a model to help predict what your target value should be. So in one aspect, it has become kind of a common use on dairy farms as a measure of diet efficiency. There's a couple of different ways if your levels are low or if they're high. While it mostly relates to protein, most directly to protein, it also relates to how that protein in the diet interacts with other parts like fiber digestibility, starch availability. But the other thing that milk-urea nitrogen also helps to represent, it helps to predict nitrogen excretion of the animal, both in the urine and in the manure. And so in that aspect, it has a connection to potential environmental issues. And we looked at how you could use milk-urea nitrogen in a field study with over 1,200 dairy farms from Pennsylvania down into the Carolinas, looking at what their levels are. And if we provide them educational information, can we change their levels in their herd? And what's that potential impact have in terms of the environmental footprint? And one, we did show that through educational information, you can change that value. And that does have an impact on the amount of nitrogen that's excreted out of the animal. And I was at the University of Maryland in the Chesapeake Bay region, very sensitive ecosystem. And the nitrification of the water is an issue, and things that can be done to decrease nitrogen flow into the waterways of the Chesapeake are important. And so that got me interested in kind of the environmental side of dairy production. And so hopefully that's a quick tour of milk-urea nitrogen in my 3 years of my PhD program.
Yeah, it was, and for everyone watching and listening, you can check out some of these papers on Dr. Jonker's, I think the Google Scholar, some of the different ResearchGate web pages. But he's extensively published on this theme, and I personally not being that well-rounded in dairy science, I found them fascinating, again, from this perspective of sort of how this sort of interesting factor, as you were just mentioning, affects sort of all parts of the value chain that we'll be getting into as we further discuss these themes. But then, Jimmy, in addition to your work in this area, and you continue to publish on these themes after your dissertation, your career takes a really interesting path the next several years, where you're not just doing science, but you're getting involved in certain areas. And I sort of rattle through some of these in the bio in terms of you served as a congressional science fellow, then you went on to be a science policy fellow at the EPA, and then the National Academy of Sciences. And here we see sort of this blend of science and policy come into play per your career, and a lot of these themes, the stuff that now further on down when we talk about NMPF, you're looking at from a much broader perspective. But talk a little bit about your time in sort of the halls of Congress and in such hallowed institutes like the EPA, and some of what you picked up sort of as you were blending science with policy.
Yeah, as I was finishing up my Ph.D., I decided I wasn't going to follow the pathway of doing a postdoc in a laboratory somewhere. I kind of got to the point where I didn't want to be in a lab anymore. I didn't necessarily want to go straight into industry. And fortuitously, a member of my graduate committee was president of the American Society of Animal Science. Nice. And she said, you should look at this fellowship opportunity. And I looked at it, I'm like, this is interesting. It's in some aspects, it is a type of postdoc, but it's not working in a laboratory. I like to call it's a policy doc for those that have PhDs. And really, it was just a way to give a scientist exposure to differing processes. And so my first fellowship that placed me on the Committee in Agriculture, working for the ranking member, Mr. Stenholm, from Texas, who recently passed away, really helped me bring together the idea of how science helps inform legislation, but doesn't necessarily drive legislation. And coming straight out of that academic background, you're like, well, science says this, so we must do this. And science helps inform. That's what I found in the beginning of that kind of public policy education that I received starting on the House Committee on Agriculture. It helps inform, but it doesn't necessarily drive. And as we know, science does not have a singular answer on a topic. Science evolves over time, and answers can change. They can change subtly, or they can change dramatically as we learn more information. And so that helped me to begin to understand how science and policy start working on that political aspect. As I was finishing up my fellowship on the Committee on Agriculture, I felt like I kind of had like one side of the public policy aspect, the legislative side. I wanted to learn more about the regulatory side, and I was able to get a AAAS fellowship that placed me in the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Water. At the time when they were working on Clean Water Act regulations related to concentrated animal feeding operations, so our larger livestock and poultry operations. And that brought me to see kind of this other side, how regulatory processes work, and how they respond to the legislation that has been passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. And so that helped me put together those two sides of policy. Sometimes as you travel through your career, some of it is you end up moving to places based upon not necessarily what you know, although that's part of it, but also who you know. As I was finishing up my fellowship at EPA, a Cornell professor who I knew but did not work closely with when I was at Cornell said, you should take a look at this opportunity at the National Academy of Sciences. They were looking to fill a position specifically to direct a expert study on air emissions from livestock operations. And this, to me, kind of put together what I learned from the legislative side, from the policy side, into the science side. because oftentimes National Academy studies are requested by agencies or by Congress to answer big questions and help determine policy moving forward. And so this was a congressionally mandated study to look at air emissions from animal feeding operations. And I just saw it as like, this is a way to combine all three elements, legislation, regulation, and science, into a step moving forward. And that's how I ended up at the National Academies. And that was a really great experience for me because it really cemented the idea that I like this interface between science and policy. After 3 years there, I ended up with an opportunity to get more involved directly in the dairy industry, which circles all the way back to the idea of growing up on a dairy farm and my interest in the dairy industry and wanting to be part of that industry in a manner that I could, based upon my educational experience and in my burgeoning policy work.
Excellent. And as such, you arrive at the National Milk Producers Federation, and I mentioned in the bio quite a broad purview. Founded all the way back in 1916, and just I pulled some of these numbers, and I don't know how accurate they are. I hope they're somewhat accurate. Around 9.5 million heads of dairy cattle throughout the United States, producing somewhere 500 million metric tons of dairy products for us. So needless to say, a very large scale alongside the scope of the organization. Introduce us to the organization a bit, Jamie. A little bit about this history, how the organization has evolved over the years to the scale that it oversees these different issues. Everything is mentioned in your bio, from taxation to environmental to safety, animal welfare. Walk us through a little bit of that, and then little later on we'll get into some of the discrete themes.
Yeah, so the National Milk Producers Federation was founded in 1916, and its members are specifically dairy cooperatives. Dairy cooperatives are owned by dairy farmers. When it was founded in 1916, the big impetus for the founding was dairy price. And economics continues to be a major component of what the National Milk Producers Federation does in Washington, D.C. Much of the milk price around the country that farmers receive is regulated through the federal milk marketing orders that were established more than 75 years ago. And so there's price discovery through that, and so that dairy farmers have a clear idea of the amount to be paid for their milk. Mm-hmm. It's a little arcane, but it's a complex pricing system, and depending upon which different types of products are in demand, it can change milk prices, and depending upon the world milk situation. We are currently exporting 20% of our U.S. production overseas. And so if a major buyer like China starts buying less, that can impact our domestic prices. Sure. So price has been a big component of the organization since its inception, but there's a lot of other areas. I work in our regulatory group. I focus in our regulatory group on the on-farm issues, animal health, food safety, so the milk before it leaves the farm and gets processed, environment, worker safety, those types of things. We have folks that work in international trade and standards because of that 20% of export. We have folks within regulatory that do food safety, so after the milk leaves the farm. Nutrition issues, and just a whole variety of things that essentially affect dairy farmers from the production of their milk to getting it to the consumers. Sure. We have 25 different dairy cooperative members that have approximately 20,000 individual dairy farm owner locations. That's about 2/3 of the dairy farmers in the U.S. and about 2/3 of the milk production in the U.S. Right. And so we don't represent everybody, but we represent the majority of dairy farmers and dairy cooperatives in the U.S. And so we kind of represent that unified voice of the national dairy industry.
Let's let's drill down into some of these buckets, because it was interesting that I first came across you, Jamie, in the the list of members of the Global Leaders Group on Antimicrobial Resistance, run via this quadripartite secretariat that includes WHO and United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as the Animal Health and the UNEP. And I previously have had Dr. De Getahoon from WHO and Dr. El Wafi from FAO on talking about antimicrobial resistance and themes of this nature. It's interesting because, from your angle, right? I mean, you have to think about this stuff from a couple perspectives, right? I mean, clearly, we need to keep these 9.5 million cattle healthy, and take care of their health. At the same time, antibiotic resistance is, I honestly, but it's one of those ones that the smart people are saying this is the major plague we got to look out for, and it's coming fast. And then obviously everything in between, because you do deal with animals, and we have this theme of One Health, where the next zoonotic thing is hopping from, going to, and so forth. So you're really at the center of all this. I found it fascinating finding you on the list there amongst these luminaries. How do you get involved with the organization, and talk a little bit about, what you think about on a daily basis when you have to think about animal health from all of these angles at once?
Yeah, the Global Leaders Group on Antimicrobial Resistance is quite a powerful group. They are helping to set the stage for the United Nations next high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance that's going to happen during the UN General Assembly meetings next year in 2024. Sometimes I look at that group and wonder, how did I get there myself? And they have a variety of different constituencies that are represented on there. And so my background really is looking at the livestock food production systems. And so when you look at kind of what I represent on there, it's kind of the primary producer in livestock, and representing their needs in this overall global issue of antimicrobial resistance. And the fact is that any use of an antimicrobial can contribute to antimicrobial resistance. So what do we do as the globe to address these issues? We need to look at it from human health. We need to look at it from animal health. We need to look at it from environmental health. That's kind of that One Health perspective where all three of these come together. And I've been involved in the past in things like the Codex Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance. So Codex is a international food safety standards process that's recognized by the World Trade Organization. I've been involved with the World Organization for Animal Health and its standard settings on differing disease conditions, and their animal welfare standards and their antimicrobial stewardship standards, both through being an expert for the U.S. dairy industry to the USDA, which is the lead agency from the U.S. to the World Organization for Animal Health, but also through the International Dairy Federation, which is kind of like I call it the Global Dairy Scientific and Technical Arm. And I led their task force on antimicrobial resistance, and have been involved in their animal health and welfare activities for more than a decade. And so really it's kind of those activities that brought the opportunity for me to be part of this Global Leaders Group on AMR. And again, it's an amazing group to be involved with, led by the Prime Minister of Barbados, people that are significant luminaries in public health and in country level health assessments. And so I'm just honored to be part of that group, and really appreciate being able to help represent that perspective and kind of needs assessment from the primary producer, those that own livestock, and how that goes through the food production system.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm glad you're there. As part of it, I think we too often think of that, especially that issue about antimicrobial resistance and stewardship as just a human health issue. But when you take into account sort of the sheer numbers, just in the case of what you're involved in terms of dairy, you see the whole other side of it, and it's important to have sort of this much broader perspective on it. So I'm glad you're there. You deserve to be there, so that's great.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
when we get down to the basics, when we look at the animal health on an individual dairy farm in, say, in the U.S., ultimately keeping the animal healthy is is better for the farmer themselves, because if the animal gets sick, they lose milk production, and they may need to be treated with antibiotics and antimicrobials. But I think it's important that when we look at antimicrobial stewardship, we want to keep antimicrobials in the toolbox available for veterinarians to use with farmers on their livestock if it's necessary. But what other interventions can we do to keep that in the toolbox most of the time? And so
right.
other things that we can do to maintain animal health, prevent them from getting sick or injured, reduces the need to use antimicrobials. And that's really, I think, part of that important aspect on helping to mitigate the risk of antimicrobial resistance through the use of antibiotics in the food sector, in the livestock and poultry sectors, is by minimizing the need to use them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That feeds nicely into sort of this theme of social responsibility in the dairy industry, and you are involved in something called the farm program, which is National Dairy Farmers Assuring Responsible Management. Here again, you go back to this theme, whether it's appropriate stewardship of the antimicrobials or all the other important things that happen on that farm, but basically the organizations highlighting the farmers that are doing the right stuff right. Talk a little bit about social responsibility, social responsible sourcing, and a little bit of the farm program, if you would.
Thank you, Ira. Yeah, the National Dairy Farm Program, Farmers Assuring Responsible Management, was started at the end of 2008. I am the original staff person on that program, so I was there at the beginning. And what was happening in the U.S. dairy sector at that time, and I think it was happening elsewhere around the world in the dairy sector, is that our customers, so the CPG companies, the fast food restaurants, the grocery stores, food service folks, were beginning to ask questions about what does production look like on the farm, from caring for the animals, the environment, antibiotic use, workforce. And at that time, we didn't really have a unified program in the U.S. dairy sector to help put together standards,
Mm-hmm.
and then to be able to evaluate farmers against those standards, and to have data for those customers who then sell those products to the consumers, the everyday public. And without data, we can say we are doing good things, but how can we prove that we're doing good things? And if we have things that we need to improve without data, how do we know what we need to change? And so we began the program in animal care, the animal welfare arena, because that was the one that was at the time probably the most pressing for the U.S. dairy sector, for questions coming from our customers. And so we put together animal care standards. We update them every 3 years. Every dairy farm that's in the program has an evaluation at minimum once every 3 years. If they're not meeting minimum requirements, they are put on an improvement program that, depending upon which standard they are not meeting, can range from as little as 48 hours to more of a continuous progress, where we want to see improvement over that 3-year cycle. And what it's really done is really helped provide that data to our customers about what's happening. It's helped standardize the type of data that's collected. And I actually think it's also improving, importantly, animal care and welfare. Because at the end of the day, as we learn new scientific information, we change how farming practices are done. And we're kind of unique in the U.S. dairy sector. We have farms ranging from Amish farms with 5 cows that milk by hand to virtually integrated dairy operations with 30,000 cows. and everything in between, dairy farms in all 50 states. And so we have a really unique sector, almost 30,000 individual farm sites, 99% of which are in our animal care program. And developing standards that are applicable from say northern Vermont, where you may get a little bit of snow and cold in winter, in St. Albans, to down around Phoenix, where it didn't dip below, on average, below 100 degrees during the entire month of July. Those dairy productions look a lot different. And so when you put together standards, you look at processes and outcomes rather than standards that say you must do it this way. We really try to be focused on the outcomes. The outcomes, we want to make sure, are we seeing excellent animal care, and if there are gaps or challenges, we want to see improvements. And so that's really where we started. And I think, to the credit of the U.S. dairy farmers, it's funded through their own dairy checkoff program. So the dairy farmers themselves fund this program to essentially have external people come and evaluate their farms, say, here's what you're doing well, here are areas for improvement, and here might be things that are so critical you need to improve them in 48 hours, 3 months, 6 months, like that. And I think it's been very successful. And there are other programs around the world that in my mind, look pretty similar. They're adapted to local conditions, but I think we've been very successful in our program.
And alongside that, obviously, in addition to doing safe, wholesome dairy products right, and creating these standards, clearly you point out that dairy farmers, obviously, because they have animals, they have land, they have to deal with water. You have to be, it's naturally made, whether it's the small producer or the larger, environmental stewards. And I think I read sort of the info, somewhere around 2% of greenhouse gas, comes from the industry. But, even though you still have net zero initiatives going on, and ultimately how to bring that down to hopefully something by 2050, zero. What's happening on the net zero front, specifically as it pertains to NMPF and the dairy industry in general?
Yeah, you mentioned that 2% number. That actually comes from the life cycle analysis that the U.S. dairy industry did a little more than a decade ago. Okay. We were one of the first major agricultural industries worldwide to do an LCA to demonstrate our contributions, and we are at that time 2% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. The LCA methodology that we utilize is actually the LCA methodology that was published by the International Dairy Federation. So circling back on that organization, that's kind of like the scientific and technical arm of the global dairy sector. They've been around for about 120 years, tackling a wide variety of scientific and technical issues. They have a lot of different standards, from food safety and product standards to transparency of production, and many of the things that we do kind of in the U.S. basis, they utilize on that international basis. And so we utilized their methodology and found that we were 2%. So we might be able to say, 2%, okay, we're done. We're not the big problem. But when we look at the challenges around climate change, much like AMR, antimicrobial resistance, it's what additional things can we do to play our role in helping to mitigate that. And that's where we get to our 2050 goals in the U.S. of being greenhouse gas neutral or better. Our emissions come mostly at the farm level. The farm level represents 85 to 90% of our overall emissions in the U.S. Dairy sector. Once the milk leaves the farm, it's that remainder. It's transportation, it's processing, it's getting it to the consumer. But most of it occurs on the farm, and it really occurs in kind of three different areas. There's the animal itself, and this is part of the unique aspect of the dairy cow being a ruminant. They've got a 4-compartment stomach. The first part is essentially a big fermentation vat. And we use fermentation vats to make beer. They use fermentation vats to extract things that we can't digest. Yep. If we were to just go out and graze on our lawn in the backyard, we probably aren't going to do very well. But our cows can utilize that because of the microflora in their rumen, in their digestive system, and that microflora takes those things we can't digest and makes them into protein sources, energy sources that the cow then utilizes to make milk. So that's great. But one of the byproducts is methane. When they talk about methane coming from the cow, most of it actually comes from the front end of the cow. They burp it out. It's not from the back end of the cow. They're not farting it out. It's actually burps.
Okay.
And that's actually representing, in some aspects, a good thing, because they're turning a lot of this plant material that we can't digest into high quality dairy milk that goes into dairy products. So in one aspect, that methane being emitted is a good thing when we think about what it's doing for converting undigestible things into nutritious products for people. But then we've got the environmental part. And so that's a challenge for us. That's about 1/3 of our overall greenhouse gas emissions are just from that burping of the cow. Then about another third is from in the U.S. is from the back end of the cow, but after the manure comes out of the animal, it's often stored in lagoons and ponds. This is actually in response to the needs around the Clean Water Act and the Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation Clean Water Act regulations, to make sure that we are minimizing the potential for pollution of waters of the U.S. And so here again, we kind of have a good and bad thing. So we have the good thing in that the EPA Clean Water Act regulations for CAFOs help reduce the risk for contaminating waters of the U.S. But it actually, with the collection of that manure, increases the emissions of methane from the manure lagoons. And essentially what's happening in the manure lagoons is similar to what's happening in the rumen. You have similar microflora that are continuing to act on those undigestible elements for us in their waste stream. And then the other third comes from essentially the production of the feed that goes into the animals, and then a small amount for just kind of general energy use on the farm. And so we've got to look at all those different areas. What can we do to reduce emissions in each of those parts? How do we get to zero? And we're not going to necessarily get the cow burps down to zero, but there are feed additives in the pipeline that might reduce it by 30%, 50%. Some promising ones, maybe even up to 80%. So we've got technology working there. We've got technology on the manure side, methane digesters, which can they capture the methane from the manure. That can be turned into electricity. It can be turned into renewable natural gas. And so we've got answers there. We are looking at the cropping systems that are being utilized in things such as cover crops, going from full to minimum or no-till systems, help increase soil carbon. We actually get sequestration there. So there are opportunities for moving us towards that zero number. We also look at the fact that dairy farms in general have cropland that produces about 40% to 50% of the overall feed that's consumed by the animal. Windmills, solar. So there's a lot of opportunities that are happening there. And some of the things that we do at the National Milk Producers Federation level is, how do we accelerate the adoption of these technologies? Things like methane digesters, that's an economic barrier. So how can we utilize things like the money that's come through the Inflation Reduction Act for promoting a greener economy? How can we work with the USDA with its existing programs on through NRCS on things like if we get a feed additive that can reduce methane emissions from the cow itself, is there an opportunity to utilize cost share funds?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the absence of cost share funds, it probably ends up being strictly a cost to the farmer without a revenue capture for them. So we want to be able to try and make these things at minimum revenue neutral, but actually, can we take these opportunities for a greener economy, bring them to the farm, and actually make them an additional revenue source for the farmer? Yeah. That's where we really want to get, is that additional revenue source to make the farmers more resilient in the face of milk prices that do change over time based upon things that happen domestically and things that happen internationally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's just interesting hearing the theme of resilience, which has been kind of the theme of the last couple of years, at least, popping up, in all these different domains. And I applaud sort of the way you think about the integrated system. Obviously, this goes back to your research for your PhD, but ultimately how to think about proper stewardship of all these factors to make things better.
And I've talked about this from a U.S. perspective, but the global dairy industry is trying to be part of the climate solution as well. And so, opportunities in other countries may look a little different. I was at a G20 conference in India last month speaking on the impacts of animal health on sustainability. Mm-hmm. And I got a chance to tour some dairy farms and dairy processing plants there. What I found interesting was that they're also using methane digesters. They're just at a different scale. So here in the U.S., our methane digesters are typically on farms with 1,000 or several thousand cows. The average farm in India is like 1.5 cows. So it's at a different scale, but they are implementing the capture of methane through their manure waste streams in a slightly different manner, but still essentially doing the same thing. And they're also looking at how they feed the cows, and what might they do to reduce the methane coming from the cow burps. Mm-hmm. And so these are really global issues, and there are solutions that can be tailored to dairy production around the world. And this is where I'm going to throw out some facts, just because I really love these facts about the global dairy sector. Cool. There's over 150 million dairy farms in the world. There are nearly 1 billion people that whose economic livelihoods are connected to the dairy industry. So that's 1 out of about every 8 people. And so the idea that we could just say do away with dairy production and say, we eliminate the methane and greenhouse gases that come from dairy production by moving to a different type of diet has a lot of other consequences to it. And the fact that 1 out of 8 people's economic livelihoods are tied to it means that we need to make informed decisions. And there are some people like simple solutions to complex problems. And, I think when we have complex problems, we actually have complex solutions. Right. There isn't a simple solution to climate change. No. There's a complex solution that involves lots of different things. And the dairy sector, both in the U.S. and globally, is working on its set of complex solutions to address what the dairy sector's contribution is to it. Yeah. And we know that other sectors are doing that as well. And that's as we circle back to the idea of where I came from at the beginning, that science, I just thought, science should just drive everything, and science needs to be part of that process. But when you start looking at the intersection of science, policy, and the public, right, it helps inform. Exactly. And so that's where it's really interesting working on these complex issues, whether it's climate change, antimicrobial resistance, other things that have just really kept me in the industry, because I know that we can tackle these issues. I know they're not necessarily easy issues to respond to, but I think that we can work collaboratively from the dairy side and do our part to address these important issues.
Among those issues, we talk climate change, antimicrobial stewardship, obviously uh, the dairy industry and science as a whole. There's I neglected at the beginning of the show to mention that in addition to all that you're involved in currently, Jamie, you also you serve two other roles. One as the executive director of the National Ice Cream Mix Association, which sounds like a really cool thing. And at the same time, you are well, you have been, I think, for about 20 years now. You have been the manager of the NFPF's annual cheese tasting contest, and I'm a huge ice cream and cheese person. All right, let's start off with ice cream because I'd love to know some ice cream issues, important things that are happening in that industry because they are near and dear to me and the three kids I have living in this house with me. So take us a little into what's going on with ice cream and ice cream mixes and important
Yeah. So,
issues.
like many industries, there are trade associations that represent big parts of it, and then trade associations that represent small parts of it. So the National Ice Cream Mix Association was formed during World War II, and they came about because during World War II there was rationing of food products,
Mm-hmm.
and they at the time were not getting much of a share of the milk production to maintain the viability of their businesses. So they formed at that time and successfully lobbied Congress that ice cream was an important product for the U.S. during wartime. You know, the idea of being able to have a simple indulgence once in a while helps the psyche. And so they successfully lobbied Congress and got an allocation for them of milk production for them to utilize in producing ice cream mix in ice cream.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of how they started. Today, they're a association that's managed by my parent organization, the National Milk Producers Federation. So even though I wear the hat on the National Ice Cream Mix Association as the executive director, it's all part of my role at National Milk. And they are today mostly focused on educational aspects for their membership. So, you know, we do educational webinars for them, help them interact and liaise with federal agencies. You know, things today that are kind of pressing for them are the issue of, you know, where do indulgent products fit in the nutrition space, and you know, as much as I would like to say you should eat ice cream at every meal, it's probably not quite the right thing we should be doing nutritionally. But strictly pulling, you know, something like ice cream entirely out of the diet, you know, leads to the idea of, you know, I'd be sad. I like ice cream. I'd have ice cream every so often. And, you know, if all of a sudden I didn't have ice cream, it would affect me, not nutritionally, but perhaps emotionally, psychologically. So that's one aspect facing them is where does a product that's indulgent fit into that broader nutrition debate.
Mm-hmm.
Other things that are affecting them are, you know, what types of product innovation do they do? We have at our annual meeting Dr. Bob Roberts, often from the Pennsylvania State University, come and talk about innovation in the product space. And during one of our more recent annual meetings, he talked about formulations of ice cream and ice cream mixes that actually could be utilized in institutional settings, like elder care homes, where getting enough protein and fat into the diet is difficult. But people like the taste of ice cream. So are there ways that we could actually use ice cream as a vehicle to help improve the nutritional intake of certain populations? And that's interesting because I talked about, you know, 2 minutes ago about, you know, an indulgence. And now I'm talking about it as potentially being an additional way to improve the nutritional profile of certain populations because they like the taste of it. And this is a way to get additional nutrition into them. And so it's an interesting arena in that, in some aspects, it's an indulgence. And in some aspects, it might be also part of a nutritional solution. Absolutely. And so I think that's one of the fun things about the Ice Cream Mix Association. It's a small organization. I think we have about 15 manufacturing members and about another 20 associate members. As part of the overall dairy industry, it's a relatively small segment, but we have many members that have been long-term members, 40, 50, 60 years. Our annual meeting has been in the same location for over 50 years. And so it's a fun aspect of part of my larger role within the National Milk Producers Federation, being the executive director for the Ice Cream Mix Association. And they are wonderful people to work with. And I've really enjoyed being able to move into that role as I'm now approaching 20 years in the National Milk Producers Federation. Just something a little different. I wanted to learn more about association management, and a small association is a great way to do that.
Absolutely. I love the theme about sort of the functional / delivery systems. There's a way to create medicines that came in ice cream form as opposed. I'm a pharmacist by undergraduate training, and wow, that'd be really cool. But no, that's awesome. Now let's talk a little about the cheese contest, because I know you've managed this now, I think, for about 2 decades now, and in the last couple of years, it went virtual, but you still undertook the tasting. Talk about the cheese contest. Talk about what happened. Just bring all the cheeses to your house during the last couple of years of virtual when you had to do the tasting. And do you have a favorite cheese?
I'll answer that last one first. Yes, I have a favorite cheese. Because many of my members manufacture cheese, I'm not going to say who it is or what cheese it is. I like all of my members' cheeses. There are just some that I like a little bit more than others. So I've got to be cautious. That's part of that membership relations in a trade association. Gotcha. Our cheese contest goes back about 50 years, and it started as a way to help improve cheese quality. Back in the early 70s, what we would call commodity cheese that's produced in large volumes, had some quality issues to it. And it started off as a way to help provide feedback to our members to improve their cheese-making processes. It's evolved over time to be a highly competitive competition. We get in the realm of 200 to 250 entries per year in 19 different classes. And cheeses that win our contest do well in other regional, national, and international contests. And so it's really become, in my mind, one of the premier cheese contests in the U.S. We conduct it every year with our annual meeting. It's a highlight. We have a giant cheese reception for the roughly 1,000 people that attend our annual meeting. And it's a way for the dairy farmers that are there and the dairy co-op staff to second guess what the judges have done. But that's really great. But you can imagine in 2020, lots of things came to a halt because of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of those was our annual meeting. Our annual meeting went virtual. So how do you conduct a virtual cheese contest? The easiest thing would have been, we will do it the next time we are in person. Right. And that would have been an easy thing to do. And one of my coworkers who has been working on the contest with me now for a few years, Michaela Hanselman, says, we really need to have the contest because the dairy farmers take so much pride in how well their co-op's cheese do in our contest, because they can say, my milk was part of this award-winning cheese. Right. And so this is where we move to, how do we conduct a virtual cheese contest? We have professional cheese judges from universities and USDA that judge our cheeses. So we had to shift, like a lot of things. We had to shift in the pandemic in 2020. And what we did is we had 3 sites around the U.S. where we had our members send their cheeses to, and there were cheese judges in each of those sites, and so different classes were in different places. Then once the judges judged those cheeses, we still had to select our overall winners, and so they took their best cheeses and shipped them to each other, and then selected in a virtual process the overall winning cheese in our contest. And there were a lot of cheese contests that were canceled that year. It's a logistically challenging to pull these things off. And I very much appreciate what my organization did to help put this forward, what our cheese judges did to help move it forward. It was, to our knowledge, the first and perhaps the only kind of virtual cheese contest held in the U.S. in 2020. And I think it turned out to be a great success because we were able to share with the dairy farmers, the wins that they have for the great products that they were putting together. And 2020 with the pandemic was challenging for them too. Right. We think about the pandemic affecting, offices, large dense populations in urban centers, but it also affected farmers. There were farmers and farm workers that got COVID. There were disruptions in supply chains. There were, amazing swings in milk prices because we had to change from 40% going through food service to, nearly everyone purchasing their dairy products at the grocery store. And so they had their challenges. And this was a way for us to keep some normalcy for them and recognize the great products that are made from the milk that they produce. And so, of all the different things that I've done, it might sound weird, but that's one of the most fulfilling things for me that I've had professionally, is being able to keep some sense of normalcy in that year when things were so abnormal.
Absolutely. We'll need a little more of that. Definitely. JB, what's coming up for the rest of the year, right? I mean, I noticed that, in addition to, all this that you're involved in, you do participate in the International Dairy Federation Summit. There's the something called the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments. You take part in all this stuff. Anything else happening for 2023 that we should know about, or as we get into 2024, in terms of some of these public forums where you're going to be speaking, attending, that we can run into?
I think the big one is the International Dairy Federation's World Dairy Summit is being held in Chicago in October. This is the first time in 30 years that the U.S. has hosted the World Dairy Summit. It's an international forum for the global dairy sector. There'll be 1,000 or more people from farmers through the value chain attending. It's kind of the premier scientific and technical dairy industry meeting worldwide. And it's the first time we've held it in the U.S. in 30 years. Again, U.S. dairy farmers are sponsors of this global meeting. We recognize the importance of the U.S. dairy industry being part of the global leadership in dairy. Dairy is probably the most locally produced product worldwide. Produced, everywhere from, you think of Iceland to Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Africa. It's produced in every country in the world, and it's produced not only from cattle, but sheep, goats, camels, horses, donkeys, reindeer, a surprising variety of animals. And it's one of the most locally produced, and it's one of the most globally traded agricultural commodities. And so, having the privilege of hosting this international forum for the first time in 30 years, I think it's a tremendous opportunity. That's very exciting to me for the fall. Next year, circling back to the Global Leaders Group on Antimicrobial Resistance, the United Nations will be holding its second high-level meeting on AMR in September of next year. That is very important. That'll be the second high-level meeting on AMR. They will be implementing kind of their next level of goals for helping to mitigate the risk on AMR, and so that's highly important. And then just I talked about the cheese contest and the challenges in 2020. There are still challenges related to the pandemic that have perhaps are waning, and perhaps some things that have are just changes to the way that business is being done. And part of that is seeing more virtual meetings. And I speak in a lot more virtual forums today than I did before the pandemic. And part of that is just the technology has allowed that. And being able to participate in international forums representing the U.S. and global dairy sector on a variety of important One Health type topics is just vitally important. Recognizing that we have to live within our planetary boundaries. Yeah. I think we are quite a ways away from being able to colonize Mars, if that's even in the future. And really, we should be doing our best to maintain our living in our planetary boundaries here, and AMR, climate change are just part of those equations.
Yeah, it's spot on, and maybe we'll see a dairy cow on Mars one day. But you hit it perfectly on the head, and I applaud you. Not just what you've done, but the fact that the way you have to think about all these integrated issues into a system like this that, as you point out, affects so many people on the planet. So I'm excited for you, and I just really enjoyed listening to the story, and as you continue to do what you do, Jamie, and rooting you on. Really, really great stuff. For everybody, again, that is going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Jamie Jonker, Vice President of Sustainability and Scientific Affairs, Chief Science Officer at the National Milk Producers Federation. Jamie, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us, educate us for a little while. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing for the global dairy sector. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people out there via what you do. Really great story.
Thank you for the opportunity. And it's again, just amazing that I'm part of what's been quite an illuminary group that you've been able to interview here over the past several years.
It's great having you. Really great having you.